Hi, welcome to this video about break-even analysis. So we'll be looking at examples about different costs that a business has, as well as break-even analysis, looking at where the point in a business is where they are no longer making a loss and they can make profit. So we call this break-even analysis, or the break-even point. So our learning objectives for this lesson is to understand the concept and calculation of revenue, fixed and variable costs, total costs, profit and loss. Then we'll look at the concept of break-even and the calculation of the break-even point. So there's two ways that we can look at a break-even point, that is through a formula or through a graph or a diagram. So the break-even point will also give us the level of output, which is how many units does the business need to produce and sell. So most businesses operate on the exchange of goods and services for the exchange of money. So this is how our economy moves and how the money moves through the economy. So when a business does exchange a good or a service for money, we call that revenue. That is the money that the business has received. So revenue is the total amount of money received from sales in a business. So there could be cash sales as well as credit sales. So if we owned a coffee shop, all the money that we received from selling coffees is called revenue. So people, consumers, would either pay cash for those coffees, or they could potentially put them on credit and then pay that at a later date. But all of that is called revenue. So here's another little small business example. So here we've got Dazza's Motors Limited, sell on average 3 cars per week at a selling price of £4,000 per vehicle. So this is an example of cash sales for his revenue. It is money coming into the business. So can you figure out what his total revenue would be for 1 week? And what about per month? So to figure out his total revenue for 1 week, we would take 3 cars times £4,000. So 4 times 3 would equal £12,000 per week. And then if we were looking at a 4-month calendar, you could times that by 4. So we would also have £48,000 monthly revenue. So to run a business costs money as well. So we are getting sales from selling our products, but we also have to pay for all the different expenses that it would cost to run that business. So there are 2 types of costs that a business mainly has, and they are fixed costs and variable costs. So firstly, fixed costs are costs that are not affected by the level of sales, so they remain the same no matter what. Examples of these costs could include rent, rates, wages, advertising, marketing, admin costs, and then telephone. So all of these things are just examples of different expenses that a business could have. So back to Dazza. So he's worked out that his fixed costs are to be £15,000, which include things like rent for the building, his telephone bills, paying another sales guy, and insurance. So these are costs that do not change depending on sales. They are always going to be that amount. The other type of cost that a business has are variable costs. So these are affected by the level of sales. So these are things like raw materials, so how much of a particular good or service do you need to make your product? Commissions, if you've got sales staff, delivery costs, so depending on how many units you need to get delivered, direct labor, so if you were building a house, you would need to, the more houses that you build, the more labor that you need, and packaging, the more products that you create and sell, the more packaging you need. So these are variable costs. They change depending on sales. If we add our fixed costs with our variable costs, that will give us our total costs. So back to Desert in our small business example, he's worked out that his variable costs are to be about £300 per car. So these are costs that change depending on the sales of cars. So if he sold one car, his variable costs are $300. If he sold 3 cars, his variable costs are $900. So they change depending on how many sales he makes. So a business needs to figure out how many products to sell to cover the costs and then make a profit. So we need to work backwards to figure out how many units of a product or service we need to sell in order to make sure we're not in debt and we're not just spending money on costs and we actually do make a profit. This is if the business is profit orientated, of course, but there are other objectives that the business will have. So to work out our profit, the equation is revenue minus costs. Then we will have our profit. So if our total revenue for our coffee shop is $100,000 and our costs might be $70,000 to run the business, then we would have a profit of $30,000. So why is this important? So the purpose of a break-even analysis, or the figuring out the break-even point, is to show us the point at which the business expects to start making a profit. Because if we don't make a profit, then we're constantly spending more money than we are earning. So then we'll be in debt, and that's a negative cash flow. So in other words, it shows us how many items a business needs to sell in order to start to make a profit. And why? So if a business wants to make changes in the price, it can show the new break-even point. So it's quite handy to learn how to do this so that you can work backwards and reverse engineer. If you want to make a particular level of profit, then you can figure out, well, maybe I need to sell 100 units. And if you up the price, well, then maybe you only need to sell 70 units. So it's a good way to figure out what price point you need to sell your product to the market. But then you need to also think about the consumer, because perhaps the consumer won't pay that price if it is too high. So it can be used to calculate the sales needed to make a profit at any given time and price. So how do we figure it out? There are 4 sets of figures that are needed to show the break-even point. So we need to know the revenue, money coming in. We need to know the fixed costs, the variable costs, which give us the total costs. So we need to balance all of these out to find the point where they are equal. So back to Dazza and our small business example. So if he sells on average 3 cars a week at a selling price of £4,000, and he's worked out that the fixed costs are £15,000 and the variable costs are £300 per car. So now we can look at how many cars does Dazza need to sell in order to break even. So we have our selling price, £4,000, variable cost, 300, fixed cost 15,000. So if we look at the contribution per unit, so what are we getting per unit of sale? So we could take away 4,000 of what we are receiving, minus the variable cost per unit, gives us £3,700 received per car. Now we've got our fixed costs, which are 15,000, divided by what we are getting per car, so 3,700 equals 4 cars. So we would need to sell 4 cars in order to break even. Any sales beyond 4 cars are now profit. So do we think that this is successful? Is selling 4 cars reasonable for this business and making profit? If he can sell 3 cars a week, so that would be 1 week plus a little bit more in order to break even per month. And what are some ways where Dazza could sell more cars? What could he do to increase that sale rate? So another way we can look at break even is through a table. So along the top, if we were looking at number of games, so a gaming shop, we've got 0, 50, 100, 150, 200. That's the number of units sold. Along the y-axis, we have our fixed costs in the yellow. So this is remember this number doesn't change. Then we also have variable costs, which do change per unit sold. And that will give us our total costs, which is the teal. Then the blue is our revenue, which is money coming in. So first of all, we put our fixed costs in, then our variable costs, which will give us our total costs. We add those together, then we'll have the money coming in. So if we put some data in for the games company, which manufactures a Monopoly-style game. So we have fixed costs of £1,000. Selling price per unit sold is £50. Variable costs per unit sold is £30. So copy this table down and have a go filling it in. Okay, so your table that you have filled in should look something like this. So the information has been put in. Our fixed costs are always going to be 1,000. They do not change. Our variable costs are dependent on the number of sales. So if we sell 0, then we've got 0 variable costs. Going back to our variable cost, it was £30 per unit. So 30 now times 50 will give us our variable cost in that second column of 1,500, 3,000, 450, and then 6,000. So we're timesing £30 times the number of units sold. Then we add those columns together to get our total costs. And then our revenue was money received from selling these games times the number of units sold. So 50 units sold, and then going back, our selling price was 50. So 50 times 50 gives us 2,500 for our second column of sales revenue, and then 5,000, 7,500, and 10,000. So looking at this table, can you see where our break-even point is? So remember, our break-even point is where we are covering our costs, and then any further sales will be profit. So we could see that our total costs, 2,500, and our sales revenue, 2,500, are the same. So when we sell 50 units, we're not losing money, but we're also not making money. So that tells us that any sales past 50, we're going to make profit. Because remember our formula, revenue minus costs equals profit. So if we look at selling 100 units, we would take 5,000 minus 4,000, we would have $1,000 profit at 100 units. So therefore, we could conclude that any sales past 50 are going to give us profit. So how do we find our break-even point? It is the meeting point of the total revenue and the total costs. And we could also look at it on a graph. So remember, break-even point is where the total revenue is equal to our total costs. So going back to our table, our total revenue at 50 units, 2,500, was exactly equal to our total costs, 2,500. So just circling where we can see where they cross over at our break-even point. So going back to our learning objectives, have you learnt the concept and calculation of revenue, fixed costs and variable costs, total costs, profit and loss? And have you learnt the concept of break-even and the calculation of the break-even point from a formula or a diagram, which gives us our break-even level of output? So we could also create a break-even graph, and it would look something like this. So this is just an example graph, but this graph shows the company's revenue and costs at all possible levels of demand and output. So the different coloured lines just relate to exactly the same thing that we've looked at so far. So we first had our fixed costs, the red line, straight across, doesn't change. Then we have our variable costs, which is the purple line. So remember, our variable costs change dependent on per unit sold. So the more units we sell, the higher the variable cost is. Total costs, we add those together, which is our yellow line. Then our sales revenue, money coming in. So remember again, where the sales is equal to the total costs is our break-even point. So we can see here that where the yellow and the green line cross over is our break-even point. So on this graph, if we read it, our output would be just over 100 and our revenue would be just under 1,500. So in the next video, we'll look into more detail about how to create your own break-even graph. So stay tuned. Thank you.